Hi, I'm Lucas,
And I'm Brian.
and this is the Quacks Podcast. Hey, you guys, welcome to the podcast. Hope life in this post-apocalyptic world is treating you well out there, and it's good to be back. Now, today my guest is Kyle Mamounis. He has a PhD in nutritional science, and he's doing some postdoc work in biochemistry. So he's very knowledgeable about cellular biology and how cells make and use energy. So I wanted his perspective on keto. Now, funnily enough, I thought he would be quite negative on it, but he actually presents a very balanced view and kind of gives both sides of the story. The interview, it also gets a little complicated at times in the details, so some people, I don't know, they might find it boring or whatnot when we kind of get into the nitty-gritty. But if you are curious about what keto does to your body, this is definitely the episode for you. Now, stay tuned until the end for a quick announcement on the podcast. Enjoy. Kyle, welcome to the podcast, man. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing pretty good. So I'm excited to have you on. We're going to talk about keto, which I've mentioned a couple times in past recordings. I don't think I've been the most positive on it, but I haven't totally dumped on it, which I think we might do today. But anyway, tell us a little bit about you, because I know you have a PhD in, I think, nutritional sciences, you said, and you're working on some postdoc stuff. So what are you up to these days?
Yeah, I did my PhD at Rutgers University in an endocrinology lab, but on a nutritional project with, it was a project trying to see the difference between saturated fats and polyunsaturated fats with hypothalamic inflammation in mice. And now I'm at University of Central Florida doing not really medical stuff, but like real basic protein biochemistry.
Okay. That's kind of interesting. Protein biochemistry, what are you looking for?
It's really niche in the biochemistry world. So I'm in this lab that I've never even heard of this before I started working on it, but there's bacterial proteins that have covalent modifications of usually 2 amino acids, and they get cross-linked, and it makes a vitamin-like part of the protein. So instead of most proteins that use vitamins as cofactors and things like that, they'll have a pocket where the vitamin will interact with the protein, and then they'll do the reaction. So these proteins do this without using any extra cofactor. They just have a second protein that gets expressed and modifies one protein to have a cofactor-like part of it. And you can you can do a lot with them because, as most people know, vitamins have colors. They're usually like yellowish, reddish. Yeah. So these proteins have those colors because the way the electrons are in the cofactor are similar to in vitamins. And so sometimes in their reactions, they'll change color, like they'll get reduced and they'll become clear, or even change color and then go back as they're cycling through the reactions. You can study a lot of things that way with spectrophotometry.
Wow, that is kind of trippy. Well, let's get into the keto diet, all right? So it's been kind of a craze, obviously, the last few years. And before we started, I thought we should kind of lay the foundation of what the keto diet is, because there are a few different keto diet variations out there, which people might not know about. But I think they all kind of share this common theme of lowering the amount of carbohydrates you're eating and eating a high amount of fat. But there's 4 different variations. So the first variation is just the standard ketogenic diet. It's very low carb, moderate protein, high fat. It's typically 75% fat, 20% protein, and 5% carbs. The second type of ketogenic diet is called cyclical, and it basically involves a period of higher carb refeeds. Something like, you have 5 days where you're on the keto diet and then 2 days where you have a lot of carbs. The third type is the targeted ketogenic diet. That diet, it allows you to add carbs kind of around workouts. And then the fourth is a high protein ketogenic diet. It's very similar to the standard diet we just talked about, but it includes more protein. So the ratio is more like 60% fat, 35% protein, and 5% carbs. So anyway, I think we should start talking about what what your body goes through when they're on keto. So I don't know, maybe you could kind of just give us a rundown. If somebody goes low carb, like what happens inside their body when they cut those carbs out?
Yeah. So depending on how much and how fast they just run down their glycogen supply. So everything's pretty normal for, I guess, a day or so. And then once you run down that glycogen supply, you flip the switch with the liver where it starts doing a lot of gluconeogenesis with proteins.
That's where they turn proteins into carbohydrates, basically?
Yeah, amino acids.
Okay.
And that starts getting exported mostly. So tissues that are more flexible, like skeletal muscle, they'll start to rely more on fatty acids. So their glucose uptake will be downregulated so that tissues like red blood cells in the brain can continue to receive what's left. So it starts, your body sort of immediately in that early period goes through a kind of like a triage, like a medical triage, but for your cells, for who gets the dwindling glucose. And then your adipocytes start getting stimulated to release free fatty acids to send out to skeletal muscle and all these other tissues that are now using more fatty acids than before.
Okay, so you run out of glycogen, and for the first day or two, everything's normal. You're just running on your stored carbohydrates, and then your fat cells start to release fat to the different areas in your body to use that as fuel?
Yeah. It's kind of like if you had, a car with two motor systems, like an electric and a gasoline engine, and it had a computer in there that kept the power output the same. And as it senses, say because batteries don't store as much energy as like a tank of gasoline, as the battery power starts to go down, the computer would tell the gas motor to start, revving up. So it's kind of like that with the fat metabolism as the glucose and glycogen start running down. So it's a continuation.
Gotcha. So I think most people who are kind of pro ketogenic diet would be like, this is the point, right? This is what we want. Mm-hmm. We want fat to be burning. So what's wrong with fat burning?
It's
I know that's a big question.
Yeah, the problem is it's a question that's highly reliant on the framework that you're thinking of it in. So just linguistically, it sounds like a good thing to burn fat because most people think of that as I'm losing weight or I'm losing fat weight. Like ever since, anything you've ever seen in the 1980s and the 1990s in ads, like fat burning, for exercise or, fat burning drugs, whatever, like the ephedra and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's kind of fat burning and then there's fat burning in the sense that we're always burning fat to a certain extent. And like I said, the different tissues can dial up and down their ratios of using fats versus carbohydrates. And some tissues are much more flexible than others, and some are not flexible at all. In the situation of just kind of pushing that as much as you can towards fat burning, so some people think, what you're burning in terms of energy substrate is neutral. Like it doesn't matter, like calories in, calories out.
Yeah.
And then some people think it's better to be burning fat than carbohydrates because they think carbs are sort of inherently, toxic or cause insulin resistance or something or whatever that is. And then some people think it's better to burn carbohydrates as much as possible. And those kinds of people, more than anything, are just using a different vocabulary and framework. So people that prefer carbohydrates, they would look at things like lower cortisol. So you don't need cortisol to do that metabolism. And you have a relationship with glucose and insulin where it goes up. Your insulin goes up when you have a meal with glucose, and then it comes down. And it's kind of this cyclical thing. And they see that as good. And also it produces more carbon dioxide while it gets oxidized. And some people talk about that being a good thing, that your respiratory quotient being higher is better. And then the people that think that fat is better think that basically insulin is bad at any amount. So they want their insulin to be as low as possible all the time. And sometimes they kind of confuse low insulin or a non-stimulated insulin system with insulin sensitivity or insensitivity. Because, if they're not consuming any carbohydrate, there's really no way for them to practically know what their sensitivity is to insulin because they're not using the system. So they would have to take a glucose tolerance test or something like that, which they wouldn't want to do because they'd drink sugar, which is bad. And yeah, and there's really simplistic benefits that some people will say, like, for example, one molecule of a fatty acid has more energy than one molecule of glucose, therefore it's better. Something like that, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but they're kind of thinking, oh, this is a better fuel. So yeah, it's the reason why sometimes when fads or a diet, it can exist for a really long time, like something like vegetarianism. The reason why it can exist for such a long time is because there's some kind of stability in the framework for the people following it. If it was really easy to come to consensus on this stuff, then you wouldn't have a prolonged dual factions on it. So it's kind of as much of a social phenomenon as anything else.
Interesting. So, I mean, you mentioned cortisol, and that was kind of always what I heard, which was, if you have carbs in your diet, that will lower the amount of cortisol in your system, and that will make your metabolism better. And if you don't have carbs in your diet, then you're going to get more cortisol, and that will actually decrease insulin sensitivity over time. So what are you kind of saying that these two kind of dueling mindsets, like one is more right than the other, or they're kind of equal, or I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah. So I see cortisol as a relatively emergency level hormone, something that is necessary for certain cellular processes at a very low level under normal circumstances, very, very low. And then if you have to go a certain amount of time fasting, it'll ramp up to mobilize energy stores outside of just the medium-term glycogen ones that we were talking about before. And I see insulin as a more consistent cyclical thing that you would expect to go up and down during meal times on a regular basis. And people that are more in the keto camp would see it the other way. They would see that cortisol and the things that it does, which is gluconeogenesis and liberation of fatty acids from adipocytes, is what you want to have as kind of a tonic level thing happening all the time. And that actually insulin is what you want to keep really, really low because that makes you fat or something like that.
I mean, is there any basis to that, to their belief?
There is a basis in the sense that the insulin system is pretty much always messed up when people become obese or have diabetes, any of the types of diabetes. It's really a question. It's like an ontological question of whether carbohydrates stimulating the insulin system causes insulin insensitivity, and that just engaging with that system at all is going to lead to those outcomes, or whether there's some other factor that causes that system to get messed up. And then, the person with these symptoms, gains weight, and maybe they can actually lose weight by cutting carbs out of their diet. Whether that's addressing the primary cause or that just happens to take away something that they're now sensitive to because of some third thing.
Okay. So basically they could have a point, is what you're saying.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the strongest point that keto people have is making a kind of like paleo or ancestral argument that, at least for some populations, for some amount of time, there was perhaps limited availability of carbohydrates in the diet, people in really northern climates and stuff like that.
That's interesting because, one of the things I see in the discussions about keto is kind of there's this like mythical unicorn of someone who can do keto for many, many years, where it seems like most people after a couple years, 2-3 years, they want carbs again. They crave carbs, and so they get back on carbs. But I don't know if that's true. Are there characteristics of people who might be good on a keto diet for many, many years?
So the kind of philosophical idea of populations that are probably, you would think, evolutionarily keto adapted because of their environment, like Arctic populations, especially in the past before trade. That's the best piece of sort of theoretical evidence for keto. But one of the worst things for keto is when those populations started actually being studied. And as far as I have seen, all of the kind of specific genetic adaptations that those populations have are in the opposite direction of being keto adapted. So they'll have, for example, genetic variants that make them more efficient at doing gluconeogenesis and things like that. So, like, I was just reading, because a couple of years ago, I actually reviewed a paper for the Journal of is it Ancestral Health, GIVO. Do you know that journal?
No, I've never seen it.
It's associated with the Ancestral Health Symposium. So, do you know Amber O'Hearn?
I do not.
She's a keto proponent. Yeah, she's pretty popular in the Twitter sphere, and she's a really big proponent of keto. And she wrote a paper talking about evidence. It's called Evidence on Chronic Ketosis in Traditional Arctic Populations. She goes through and tries to explain why it is that Arctic peoples are actually more resistant to ketogenesis than regular people. So they took a bunch of Arctic peoples and fasted them, and they actually take longer to start producing measurable amounts of ketones than regular, standard American diet eating people. And these are studies from a long time ago, like in the 20th century. Some of them are in the early 20th century.
Interesting.
And then in the later, very interesting, counterintuitive. And then in the later 20th century, when they had molecular biology, that's when they started finding these genes that I was talking about, such as there's like a CYP1A variant. There's a variant in the CPT, the carnitine palmitoyltransferase system. Basically, a bunch of genetic differences that make them resistant to getting into ketosis and to be able to simultaneously do high levels of gluconeogenesis and traditional beta oxidation of fatty acids without producing ketones longer on a carb restricted or even a fasted situation than a normal person on a regular medium or high carbohydrate diet.
Okay. So you would think that these northern peoples would be better, they become keto faster, but actually they become keto slower. They're better at creating carbohydrates from proteins than they are at burning fat. And that's like totally opposite of what you would think. So what would that mean? That people in tropical climates basically are, become keto the fastest? Is that what that means?
That would be consistent with these results. I have never looked to see if there's been like a genetic or a global measurement of these things. This was just something that people assumed. Okay, so there's these people and they eat all kinds of whale blubber and meat all year round, and they have extremely limited access to carbohydrates. So we're going to expect them to be in ketosis and to go into ketosis very easily if they're not already from fasting and things like that. And it didn't happen. So I don't know about tropical peoples. I just know that whatever they were calling kind of the control population, like just say your average American in 1950 or 1970 was actually fell into ketogenesis faster than the average Inuit.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I have this theory about keto, and maybe you tell me what you think. A lot of times we see that those on a keto diet, they do really well when they first start, extremely well. They feel better, they have more energy, they lose weight, they sleep better. It's like all upside. But over time, a lot of those people stop losing weight. They start getting cold and anxious, and they find carbohydrates like intolerable. If they eat any carbs at all, they gain weight rapidly. Mm-hmm. So my theory is that when they first started keto, they get off grains and sugar, and this causes a die-off in their gut of bad bacteria. It shifts the balance in the microbiome, and they start, feeling and doing a lot better. but they think they're doing better because of the evil carbohydrates that are, that they're now avoiding. I actually remember in a Joe Rogan podcast, I think it was, with Jordan Peterson, at one point, Peterson says that carbs actually look like poison, to him. But this isn't true. It's actually a shifting in the gut bacteria, which is helpful. Over time, the low carb and the lack of glycogen raises cortisol, and they start getting hypothyroid and metabolic syndrome. And this kind of accounts for the progressive intolerance of carbohydrates, because as they get more and more broken down from the cortisol metabolically, any carbohydrates are going to cause like water retention, lack of energy, weight gain, all that. Mm-hmm. So really, maybe the solution for metabolic disease is not so much keto, but antibiotics instead, or herbal antibiotics. And interestingly enough, most of the herbs and supplements that help blood sugar levels are antibiotic in nature. Like, berberine is one of the most powerful ones, and it's an antibiotic that is powerful as rifaximin, an antibiotic mm-hmm. for SIBO. So I don't know. What do you think of that theory?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Either a die-off or just, I guess it would be a die-off, or maybe an extreme lowering of the just metabolic activity of whatever kind of bacteria is probably producing endotoxin in the small intestine. It'd be interesting to see. I know there's a lot of postprandial endotoxemia studies out there.
Yeah.
And generally people that are, obese or diabetic or have heart disease have higher postprandial endotoxemia than healthy comparison.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see, take a group of people that go on keto to lose weight and do, a postprandial endotoxemia measurement on them before the dietary change and after, and see if, there's a big difference. I would expect that's probably it, because that would be like taking a big burden off of the system all of a sudden. Almost like a gastric bypass, it's like they're cutting out this thing that was weighing down their metabolism, all of this bacterial products that are getting absorbed across their intestines into their blood.
Well, and another thing I noticed, though, just to take a contrary position, is some people are like dying of insulin resistance, and they go on a keto diet and they lose 50 pounds or whatever, and they have all kinds of symptoms like, neuropathy and exhaustion go away. So it can really improve your life in some way. But I don't know, can keto be healthy, do you think? Or is it healthy for just a little while?
I don't know. I don't know if there's clearly got to be some kind of, individual interpersonal difference in how well people do on keto. And like some people, we've all heard of anecdotal stories of people that just crash within a year. And then there's people that claim to have been doing it for 10 years. So I don't know if it's that maybe the person who crashes is starting from some type of health issue and the person that lasts longer starts off healthier, or if that second person is more suited to that kind of a diet, or a little bit of both. It's one of those difficult things, because I don't know that many keto people right now. But I know that it's a fanatical kind of group, and vegetarians are also fanatical, or I should really just say vegans. And those people have all kinds of health problems, and it doesn't seem to ever stop the movement. So there's always new people. Like there will be these influencers that are around for 5 or 10 years telling people about their great health transformation doing this diet. And then a really high number of these people get caught cheating on their diet. I'm talking about vegans.
Yeah.
Or they'll have some kind of, oh my God, I had a really serious health problem and now I'm not doing that anymore. And it never really seems to cause much of an issue. Like there's a certain dynamic equilibrium in the movement. And I suspect that that's been achieved with keto. Like keto has kind of reached critical mass to become a mainstream thing that's really not going to go away. So there's enough people that are into it, and any kind of negative effects, I think, would take long enough that it'll achieve a kind of dynamic equilibrium. I don't think I would definitely recommend against people doing a ketogenic diet long term. But I can't really say that it's impossible that somebody could do fairly well on it long term. I'm sure there's all kinds of people out there.
When you recommend against it long term, is that because of the cortisol, or is there some other factor that you think is bad?
The cortisol is definitely part of it, but it's that whole system of emergency metabolism that it seems to mimic that I think is just bad to have chronically. So I see that system as a temporary system. Like, okay, you don't have food, because all of the hormones, cortisol, the catecholamines, all the adrenal hormones, and all the things that stimulate them from the pituitary and everything, they're basically the same hormonal profile that you have when you're fasting or starving. So it just seems counterintuitive that just really looks like a short-term adaptation to a lack of something. And so just from that kind of big picture perspective, it seems like a bad idea to take what really seems like a short-term emergency thing and use that as your regular day-to-day chronic physiological state. And then when you get into each individual thing, like, free fatty acids in the blood and what that does to, for example, the insulin system, in addition to cortisol, all of these things it seems like they actually make, if you did have insulin resistance, it would make it actually worse. And you just wouldn't notice because there's such little glucose in your system anyway. Although I'm sure there's plenty of people that are on keto and still have, elevated fasting glucose and because their liver is just putting out too much from gluconeogenesis.
Interesting. I haven't actually heard of that. So they're producing too many carbs by gluconeogenesis? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, that's where most hyperglycemia comes from, is especially in the fasted state. It's not so much, people will clear glucose, people that have diabetic symptoms or insulin resistant, they'll clear dietary glucose slower than normal people. But the thing that really keeps their glucose elevated much higher than normal people and for much longer is that the liver is putting out glucose and it doesn't stop. It's not getting the signal that there's glucose in the blood because that signal is insulin dependent and the insulin isn't signaling correctly. So the liver is putting out glucose and some cells are using it, but it's achieved a dynamic equilibrium where the level is always maintained high.
And why does that happen?
Well, at the very specific level, so the insulin hormone, according to cell receptor theory, binds to a dimer receptor, an insulin receptor. And the way the theory goes is that the things that cause insulin resistance change the qualities of that receptor such that it can usually still bind insulin fairly well, but it has a bunch of other proteins. So the receptor is looking outward into the system from the cell and then points inward. So it crosses the membrane. And then when it binds insulin, it tells all these other downstream proteins, it gives that message, and then they eventually affect a change in glucose metabolism. And that all of these things, whether it's free fatty acids or cortisol or endotoxin or inflammatory cytokines that block insulin signaling or make it resistant to that signaling, change that downstream system such that it doesn't signal anymore.
Do you think that theory holds weight, or do you think something else might be happening?
I think that it's at least partially correct. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the factors and qualities of the different players that, if you just Google image search like insulin receptor, insulin resistance, and it'll have a bunch of abbreviations of proteins, and all this stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if that changed a lot over the years, that, oh, actually this protein does this and not this, and this one, blah, blah, blah. But the overall story that, cortisol, in the presence of cortisol in the system, and things like endotoxin, anything that's inflammatory, that interferes with that signaling system, and that even that's sort of an evolved thing to do. Like in an emergency, you want a lot of your tissues to not take up glucose and to have it for the brain and the blood cells, the red blood cells.
Gotcha.
That makes sense to me.
Gotcha.
It's just not being able to turn that off.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the brain. One of the things I wonder about is how the high amounts of cortisol kind of affect your brain. Because a lot of people who I see get into keto for a long time, they kind of get weirder and weirder. You know, they start doing like intermittent fasting with like a 1 hour feeding window, or, you know, fasting for days on end. Do you think that's a fact? Do you think cortisol can kind of mess up your brain?
I don't know if it's just the cortisol, but it seems like there's something. You know how some people get addicted to runner's high?
Yeah.
It seems to be, to me, because I've seen videos of like Jordan Peterson's daughter.
Yeah, Michaela.
Yeah, Michaela, she'll have a video. Oh, you know, I'm however many hours into a fast, like over 24 hours. And yeah, she kind of seems like she's having a quasi like religious experience where, yeah, something about her brain and her consciousness is, you know, she's almost going through like this like ecstasy of depriving herself of nutrition. And that maybe that's on a certain level addictive, you know, like something like a runner's high where you kind of get this surge, you know, cortisol. And I imagine for these people over time, they might get more hardcore because to get that surge and that feeling, it might take more and more fasting, you know, because as they become keto adapted, so to speak.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed when I worked in a health food store was people who got into fasting, like their first fast that they did, they loved it so much. It was like it opened their eyes. They felt amazing. They felt 10 years younger. I mean, they couldn't stop talking about fasting. But the next fast they did wasn't quite as good. And so they would say, well, instead of 4 days, I'm going to do 7, you know, and they kind of just kept pushing the envelope on fasting. And while they were doing this, like their whole life was falling apart. You know, they were losing their job. They were breaking up with their girlfriend or boyfriend. And it was all, the reasoning they gave was some kind of spiritual thing. Well, you know, this is the way my life is going now. This is my new direction or something like that. And so I was always I felt trepidation telling people to fast because I knew it kind of had this addictive quality, and objectively, it always seemed to make their life worse over time.
Yeah. My experience with those kinds of people was from forums, and I used to be on a forum called the Raw Paleo Forum.
Okay. Which
is mostly, you know, people that basically just eat raw meat as their diet. And yeah, it's hard. A lot of those people at the time were kind of normal people, and they might have had some health problems. And yeah, they try this diet and they feel good. And then they kind of, like you said, that initial like, oh, I fixed a problem. I fixed a health problem. Like I used to, whatever it was, like feel crappy after eating some sort of irritation or something. And that goes away. And then over time, other problems come up, and they've convinced themselves, you know, whether it's fasting or a certain kind of diet, that that's the only thing that can help them. So they just have to do it more.
Yeah.
And there's really only one direction. Like if that one method is not the method to solve their problem, and that's the only thing that they can think of, then like you can see right there how that's going to go wrong.
Something about like a hammer and a nail, right?
Right.
Another thing I noticed is these low carb dieters, they tend to be alcohol intolerant. Do you have any idea why that might be?
You know, I haven't heard about that. I haven't really talked to people that are like long-term low carbers and alcohol. And because I used to do low carb. I don't really remember that happening, although I guess I didn't drink enough. I mean, this is a good thing and a bad thing, but I didn't drink enough to really have a good, consistent handle on what my tolerance was, if you know what I mean. Uh-huh. Like if you just do it so infrequently, you don't really know, okay, like this is how I react to this much alcohol. Like I never really got to the point where I drank enough to actually know that about myself. But my guess would be is that their liver is much more busy doing gluconeogenesis and ketogenesis. And since most alcohol is metabolized in the liver, that, just those enzymes are getting less attention than in a person whose liver is allowed to kind of turn off and be more passive during the postprandial glucose feeding phase.
Okay.
That would be my guess. Because, basically the liver is this powerhouse that does everything. I mean, next to the brain, it's probably the most metabolic tissue and muscle when it's working. But, at rest, the liver it's voracious. It takes up tons of nutrition. It kind of has first pass at everything. After it goes through the digestive system, the liver kind of gets to pick and choose before it gets to other tissues what it takes out, which is why it's so flexible, because if it just took everything, then the other tissues would be chronically starved. So it has a tremendous ability to go, okay, I don't need this right now. Let that go to the downstream tissues. And when you're on a physiological cycle where you consume a glucose meal, with proteins, with some fats or whatever, your liver will kind of go sort of wax on, wax off. Like when you're fed, it's kind of quiet and it's taking things up and it's not really putting that much out. It's putting out some of the fat and cholesterol that you ate and cholesterol that it produced in chylomicrons and then in the lipoproteins.
Okay. But,
it's not doing gluconeogenesis. It's not releasing a lot of stuff. It doesn't have to do as much. And then, if you fast for a while, then it's I guess exocrine and exporting activity goes up. Whereas people that are never eating carbohydrates, the liver never gets that take in glucose and sort of be quiet in that way thing. It's just always on.
Interesting.
So that's my guess.
Another thing I see with keto people is they excrete more salt. Do you know why that is?
No, I don't know why that. I guess it would be.
You know how they like the whole keto flu? Like you get on a keto diet and you have the keto flu and you have to drink electrolytes because you're basically peeing out all your electrolytes. Have you heard of that?
I have. I thought the keto flu was just feeling like crap. I didn't know it had that specific peeing symptom. Yeah, I mean, it's probably just that, how are you going to, because, cortisol and all those adrenal hormones, they're turned so high up that's also how you regulate the salt supply. So I wouldn't be surprised at that at all.
Okay. So one of the ways I think keto kind of sets you up for failure, and you tell me what you think about this, is your body kind of naturally craves carbohydrates, right? It isn't like this broken mechanism that you're craving carbohydrates that you have to willpower down. So like, let's say you lose this weight on keto and you're at your ideal weight. So you relax a bit on the keto. You eat more carbs because you obviously naturally crave them. You gain some of the weight back and you think, oh, I gained weight because I included these carbs back in my diet. I have to get back on keto to lose weight. So you end up getting yourself into this kind of yo-yo cycle of gaining and losing weight, which is definitely not healthy. But you stay in that yo-yo cycle because you don't understand that your slip-ups on your diet are when you're tired and you don't have the willpower to kind of suppress your body's urges for carbohydrates. So like, I don't know, willpower, it's really an interesting subject because like over the years, I've found that any kind of diet or supplement regime that takes willpower, it almost always fails eventually. Like you have a few stressful moments at work or someone dies in your family or you break up or whatever, and your regime just goes to total crap because, you don't have any more willpower. And the one thing I will say this about keto, I think that they get right is the whole insulin and its connection with fat storage. Now, like I said earlier, I think the solution is, antibiotic herbs and substances that'd be way better for lowering insulin resistance than cutting carbs. So I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I definitely had that issue. I had that issue, the willpower issue and the yo-yo. Like I never really had a problem with weight. I didn't come at diet and nutrition from that place, of wanting to lose weight. It was more just something I was interested in. When I was on like a vegetarian, vegetarian wasn't that bad because there's all kinds of crap you can eat. But like a vegan diet and more hardcore variants of vegan diets, I would cheat on my diet. And when I would cheat, it wasn't like a small, thing. It would be like 3,000 calories of just whatever I could obtain until I felt sick that wasn't on my diet. And when I was on a low carb diet and when I was mostly doing like raw meat, I would have, it wasn't as bad. I think that my body was getting a little bit more of what it needed, eating mostly meat. But at the same time, I was never really 100%. I did do, I think, 2 weeks of nothing but raw meat. And that was weird. I felt really weird. Like my body just felt weird. I guess it was probably like keto flu or whatever. My sleep felt differently. Like in a weird way. It's kind of hard to explain. But yeah, when I would like taste a carb, it's like something wakes up in you, and it is hard to, I guess that's why, a lot of people like propagandists will say, oh, sugar, it's like cocaine because look, the same part of the brain lights up, when you like, as if the brain saying this thing is good implies that it's bad. Mm-hmm. I remember one time I was in a conference and people were saying, they were kind of hinting or making this rhetorical suggestion that sugar is bad because it's kind of hacking into the cocaine receptor or the cocaine response, I guess, like, neurological response, instead of what seems to me the more obvious conclusion, which is cocaine and other drugs are kind of hacking the normal food reward response that you get from consuming, like sugar or
that makes
like all the
sense.
macronutrients.
That makes much more sense.
Right. Because why would we have a system set up to respond to drugs that haven't been around for that long? Like, I mean, cocaine's been around for like, I guess a few centuries or maybe several centuries, but certainly like synthetic methamphetamines and things like that are pretty novel. And it would be very weird if we had, quote, a receptor, unquote, for that.
Yeah.
Or just a response, and that it wasn't, something that is just happens to induce a brain activity similar to maybe like an extreme food reward, and that's why it feels so good, or something like that.
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned before, and I want to get to it real quick before we have to end it, but you mentioned insulin and kind of how it's a cyclical hormone, whereas cortisol is just kind of always suppressed. And, the people in the keto camp kind of switch that around. Can you maybe just talk a bit about insulin? Like, have you found anything interesting about insulin lately that might be outside of the box or anything like that?
Actually, about a year ago, so I have on my laptop, I have a pretty chaotic Chrome tabs situation. I have a lot of tabs open.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And I was actually explaining this to my girlfriend yesterday because she was like, it's so crazy because so many things in your life are kind of regimented and then your Chrome looks like a disaster. But there's a system. Everything to the left of my work email tab is kind of long-term storage.
Nice.
And everything to the right. So anyway, somewhere on the left of my work email tab, there's a tab for, it was a popular article, like one of those websites like Science Weekly, or I don't know what they're called, but websites where a journalist, maybe even a scientist who's being a journalist, will write about a science article.
Yes.
So it's not primary literature. Yeah, so one of those types of websites had a article that I wanted to write about or make a video about or something on a theoretical level, which is it was about ants, and it said ants were able to evolve their sort of eusocial system of interaction with insulin, and that something about the way it interacts in their brains allows them to sort of communicate and have the social system that they have.
Okay.
And I forget a lot of the particulars, but what was really interesting was that things like insulin and a lot of these proteins, hormonal proteins, and the steroidal, lipid-based protein hormones, they're in all sort of organisms, and they have a long history, and it seems like they get copy and pasted to do different things. Like in one animal, it'll do this, and another it'll do that, and then maybe in something totally different, like an insect, it'll have quite a bit of like the homology between, say, the genetic sequence of our insulin and ant insulin is probably quite a bit different, but it's close enough that you can tell it's insulin. It'll do sort of a totally different thing. And I'm not exactly sure what I want to say about that, except that it's sort of this old system, and all these things are really old systems, and we should be thinking of them in terms of, what they're intended to do, and not really thinking of them on a sort of pharmacological basis, like as if they're like foreign bodies, like, oh, my insulin is high and insulin is bad, and like my body is trying to hurt me with this insulin or something like that. So that's really all the interesting thing I have to say about insulin. I mean, I've never really studied insulin on the protein level. It's kind of interesting. Like, the only biochemistry I know about it is that it gets cut up into 3 pieces, and the middle piece gets just kind of broken down and taken away, and then the 2 original pieces are connected. So it's kind of like it's put together in a weird way. And I suspect that the ability of insulin to be cleaved and arranged in that way allows it to have different effects and be sort of biologically flexible for different organisms.
Wow. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So I think you're basically saying, and you tell me if this is right, that a lot of times insulin is treated as like this bad guy, but it has such a long history with humans that it's not just there by mistake. Your body has an intelligence, and it's trying to use it in the correct way. And so focusing on insulin as the bad guy is probably not as productive as focusing on, I don't know, environmental factors or something else.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess people could flip it around and say, like, oh, well, you think cortisol is the bad guy. And actually, I don't really think anything is the bad guy. Like, even, estrogen or something like that a lot of people think is the bad guy. I mean, people, if you have a pituitary damage and you can't produce any cortisol, people die from that, like pretty quickly. Like they have trouble with their cardiovascular system and just kind of keeping the vessel tone. So yeah, these things are needed. It's kind of understanding that this thing, it's obviously there for a reason. Obviously, it's not some sort of like I don't know, like a devil kind of
it's the
almost
guy.
like in a biblical framework. Like that's kind of like a silly way to think of it. It's like the body. There's a certain tragic quality to the body in the sense that we're all going to die eventually.
Wow, this is turning dark, but let's do it.
Right. So when you're thinking of these things, I think a lot of people are thinking, and I've seen people say this explicitly, oh, well, people die because, like, as if that's an aberration, or that, and, when, just think of it like, okay, you're a child and then you grow, and the metabolism that's causing that. Like, for example, if you had the same growth factors as an adult that you did as a child in certain tissues, you'd call that cancer, So, there's kind of a time and a place for all these things, and a season. And I think a lot of people sort of intellectually want to remove themselves from like meat space and like overly intellectualize things like, oh, this is good, this is bad. When really it's like our body is in, and, really I blame when you open up a medical textbook or a physiology textbook, there's all these cartoon drawings and there's static images. And so much of what we look at is a static image, like a lot of microscopy, electron microscopy, for example, to really look at the smallest things. That's a dead cell. It's been all beat up and covered with like metal so that the electrons can visualize it. I think that really messes with people's minds when, if you look at, for example, like in a light microscope that's not that powerful and allows cells to live, like a moving cell, and to sort of try to imagine like, okay, so in that thing that's vibrating so quickly on that stage under the microscope, all that stuff is there, like glucose and everything. And depending on what kind of cell it is, insulin, whatever. And those things are getting made and broken down and moved around really, really fast. So, thinking of it like as a process rather than the static image, like, okay, there's insulin, that's bad. Or
yeah, I get you. So basically in this podcast, we've, kind of talked a little bit about keto from the 30,000 foot view, I'd say. If you were, I mean, I know you don't have a practice or you're not a health coach or anything like that, but if you had a friend who was doing keto and was doing really well on it, I mean, would you encourage him to keep doing it? Would you say, this might be good for a while, but get off of it? Or, what would you say?
I would strongly encourage him to make sure that he's getting blood work done on a regular basis and to really pay attention to get a full thyroid panel and to make sure that T3 and T4 doesn't go down over time, because I believe that's really one of the biggest things that you'll see over time go down. So it appears that thyroid production in the liver is pretty much glucose dependent. And regardless of other health factors, your thyroid production will go down if the liver just doesn't have as much glycogen in it. It's just kind of like okay, we don't have glycogen, don't make as much thyroid because we don't want, as much of a metabolic rate. Yeah, those kinds of objective measures I would try to encourage, because I think that might help. Because I'm not really in the business of telling people like, oh, this thing that you're doing is bad. That doesn't really work. And yeah, it's just, I mean, I did that for many, many years. And I did that specifically when I was giving people advice that I think is bad advice now. So that experience has like humbled me in the area of giving, declarative advice to other people when they're not asking for it. But yeah, I would just give them maybe things like blood work, or if they feel cold, after eating or in the morning more than usual, give them things to watch out for like that are pretty objective, that I would think would be a hint that their health is going down on that diet, and that would maybe help them psychologically kind of accept that, because that's really the problem, is if you have somebody, especially if they did lose 50 pounds and they feel a lot better, it's going to take a lot for them to psychologically switch and think, okay, maybe this isn't like healthy for me long term. So yeah, I would just do things like that. Just kind of suggest, oh, okay, well, just look out for this, and it'd be really good if you did this and this, and maybe even just say that as a general thing, and not talk about because this is going to show that your diet's bad, but just a thing to look at, and they'll get those results. And I suspect, somebody that's on a strict keto diet for years, even just 1 year, they're probably going to notice like, oh, wow, I do kind of feel cold. Like, well, I used to feel more warm after eating or in the morning, or even if they take their body temperature, oh, it's actually kind of gone down like half a degree. My thyroid numbers have gone down a little bit, things like that. And then you can kind of use that like as okay, here's what that could mean.
That's actually really good advice. Like I did low carb too for a while. I mean, I'm a type 1 diabetic, so I can't go zero carb. But I did low carb for a while, and it was an absolute hell. I mean, I had terrible insomnia. I couldn't sleep for more than a couple hours at a time before getting up and going to the bathroom, and had bad anxiety too. So, I mean, I get that, because I went through hell until I finally was like, maybe I should add more carbs into my diet. And it just took a while to kind of break through that mental carbs are evil mindset. So anyway, well, I don't really have much more, but it's not really about keto. But I know you've done a ton of experimentation with your diet and supplements and all that, like you've been talking about. So what are you into right now? What are you doing? Got any practices that are cool?
Yeah. I just started, let's see, what do I do? I've been drinking orange juice again. I hadn't been drinking orange juice for a while. In this whole viral age that we're in, I decided to experiment with vitamin C, because I really never took. I'm not that experienced with supplements. I was never really a big supplement person.
Okay.
Even when I was on like vegan diets and stuff, I mean, I was really young then. in my early 20s. I probably took B12 and that was about it. But yeah, I've been taking some vitamin C, getting a glass of orange juice, dumping in glycine, sometimes some collagen powder as well, methylene blue, some sugar.
Oh, wow.
Extra sugar and a little bit of salt.
Okay.
And drinking that down, and then usually also having some coffee, with milk and sugar in the morning. And I'm pretty much I always have a container with some liver that I cooked, and I'll throw just a few pieces of that on a meal, usually once a day or every other day. And yeah, other than that, I kind of eat like a normal diet. I mean, recently I haven't been going to the store that much, and I'll take maybe like a canned soup, like Amy's, that brand?
The organic brand. They're good.
Yeah, I'll just dump that in a saucepan, and then I'll add, say, some meat that I cooked. Like I'll cook a bunch of meat and put it in a glass container in the fridge and add some liver and stuff like that and heat that up. Maybe dump in some collagen powder and dissolve that. And that'll be a meal.
Nice. Well, how is the orange juice methylene blue sugar cocktail working for you?
It's good. It's good.
Do you notice anything?
No, it just feels good. It feels like, like I kind of get going in the morning, and, like I feel like I'm pretty much like I get up, and because I'm not a morning person. So anything where I can kind of get up and, drink something, eat something, and then sort of feel like, okay, I am able to do things. That's always a good sign for me.
Nice.
It's really easy for me to forget to eat in the morning too.
Ah.
So I don't know if you have that problem, but
no, I don't.
So it's best if I have like because I can eat, like I actually, my I think my metabolism or something, it kind of speeds up at night. Sort of weird. Like I get hungrier at night. So for me, having sort of just a little routine, like, okay, I have this weird orange juice thing, I have some coffee, and then I'll have a small meal. And after that, I kind of just eat as the day goes on. But it's always good for me to have like a specific routine in the morning, or else I'll forget to eat until like noon.
Yeah, I'm pretty regimented. I mean, with the whole blood sugar thing, I pretty much do the same thing every day, and that's breakfast. Right. So yeah. Well, before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to cover?
I don't know, not really. I mean, obviously, like this whole coronavirus thing is going on, but I don't. I will say one thing about that. I think I'm actually going to email my boss, because he used to work with heme proteins, but bacterial ones. And I saw an interesting article. I shared it in the Ray Peat fans Facebook group. There were some threads about it where some people are claiming that the virus knocks heme iron out of hemoglobin.
Yes, I've read that.
Yes, and that's what causes the hypoxia, which explains, if true, why ventilation is so useless, because it doesn't matter, how much oxygen is pushed into the lungs if there's not enough, intact hemoglobin to grab it and move it. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was interesting. I also thought, maybe some of the old, like we have a bunch of structures at work of heme proteins and stuff, and it'd be interesting to look at that. I don't know if I could build. Do you know the program PyMol?
No.
It's a biochemistry program. Yeah, it's like this old thing that if you take biochemistry, they kind of make you use it. And it's really boring, but if you actually have a protein you work with, it's interesting because it builds the proteins. Like you just give the amino acid sequence, and it puts it together based on electrostatic rules of the amino acids interacting with each other.
Okay.
And so it kind of can predict what a protein would look like based on the sequence. And then you can also put in confirmed structures that have been crystallized of proteins, and then it kind of knows exactly what's going on. Anyway, you can sort of look at things and go, okay, so here's where this is. And I guess, maybe the virus like connects on this part. I guess that's how people make a lot of drugs. Although there's a lot of issues with that kind of biochemistry too, where they'll make a drug and it'll sort of do something, and they'll be like, okay, I know that it did this exact thing. And
they don't really know.
It's really hard to confirm that kind of stuff. And I suspect a lot of drugs just sort of get the result they want and they can kind of make an argument that it probably is doing this exact mechanism. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, as that science gets more and more sophisticated, a lot of these things, people are like, oh, actually it works this way, you know?
Yeah, for sure. All right, man. Well, thanks for being on the podcast. I appreciate you spending a little time with me today.
Yeah, it was fun.
Oh, before we go, what do you have a podcast? What are you into? Like, what are you doing right now?
So sometimes I talk to this guy, Steve Businger, about nutrition and stuff. And we have a YouTube channel, Nutrition Deconstructed. And then I have my own YouTube channel, Nutrichronology.
Okay, I'll put both of those in the show notes. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you kind of go really a lot deeper into biochemistry.
In the Nutrition Deconstructed, we kind of talk, it's sort of like almost postmodernism, but for science, like about some of these meta-narratives, like what I was saying about, you know, people and their psychology around their diet, you know, whether it's like keto or something, and how these concepts kind of interact on a psychological basis. We talk about a lot of that stuff and like the culture of science and philosophy of science.
Interesting.
I guess it's like a philosophy of science. And then in the Nutrichronology, I'm not sure exactly what that's going to be. Like, I have a lot of old blog posts from when I used to have a website that I want to just turn into video essays. And I thought that was going to be really easy. And then I did one of them, and it's like an 8-minute video, but I put so many images on there that the editing took like hours and hours and hours. So,
oh, man.
So I really want to do that. And I want to make interesting things. Like, I want to make a video as a challenge to keto people. This is the next video I want to make, where I'm going to basically explain to them why they use carbohydrates to work out. And there's nothing they can do about it, because the amount of energy that gets produced from fatty acids or ketones, basically anything except glucose, just can't deliver enough power for exercise that is like maybe 70% or more of VO2 max. So anything like sprinting, weightlifting, anything like that, no matter how keto you are, no matter how little carbs you eat, your muscles are using carbs.
Gotcha.
To do that. And, you know, I wanted to explain like on an electrical power level, you know, like, okay, this is how fast these different, because basically glycolysis, you know, the fastest is you got your creatine phosphate, and that gets broken down immediately in muscles. And that's like a few seconds of energy. And then you got your glycogen breakdown. And then, you know, fatty acids and full oxidation of glucose and all that takes so long that you really can't do, like, that's when you get basically fatigue, you know, is you can't really do something like, say, weightlifting or sprinting on those fuels aerobically.
Interesting. All right, cool, man. Well, I'll have those channels in the show notes. But thanks for coming on, bro.
It was fun.
So I really appreciate Kyle coming on. If I could sum up what I took from this episode, it is that ketosis is an emergency system the body uses. For some people with metabolic problems, you know, that system's going to work great for a while. Long-term, it seems risky, and I think most people find that keto long-term is really not sustainable. The other thing that he said that I thought was really interesting is that ketosis, these keto diets, they don't really solve the underlying insulin resistance problem. You know, you're just cutting out the insulin system by not eating carbs, and you're ramping up the cortisol, so you don't have to deal with the metabolic problems that being insulin resistant is. And so it's almost like papering over the problem a little bit. And for some people, that is what they need to get out of, you know, whatever trap that they're in. But for other people, it's not so great. So it was a really balanced view by Kyle. So I appreciated what he had to say quite a bit. Now, as for the podcast, I'm going to be shifting the structure. So for the last year, we have done an episode probably every week, with a couple weeks missed here and there. We had a mix of interviews in there, but most episodes were Brian and I doing our own thing. I'm going to shift the show to doing more interviews and less me and Brian episodes. So after a year of doing, you know, weekly research, I'm kind of I'm running out of low-hanging fruit here, and the research is getting more complex and taking me longer. And I also I don't want to rehash what we've already done either. See, when I started the podcast, it was a discipline for me, to write and research these episodes every week. And I knew, that I had somewhere around 60 topics that I wanted to talk about. Now, those topics are mostly done. And I don't really want to just put out fluff every week just so I can say, I have a weekly podcast. Like, hey, let's talk about nettle this week. Let's talk about echinacea. Like, I really want to give you episodes that are high quality and engaging. So going forward, there's going to be less episodes with me and Brian, but the episodes we will do will be higher quality and more focused. They're not going to be just so much me and Brian chilling out and talking about Star Wars as much. The new release schedule will probably go to 1 to 3 episodes a month instead of doing 4. And I was also thinking of changing the podcast name to something that was more easily searchable in Podcast Engine. Like, you tell me what you think about this. But a friend of mine basically said, hey, you can't really find quacks if you're looking up health podcasts, change it to something like natural health hacks or something, just so that it's easily findable. And I thought that was a good idea, but I don't know. So feel free to let me know your thoughts about this change by sending me a message through the website or emailing me at quackspodcast@gmail.com. And again, as always, if you gained value from this show, help us out by liking and sharing with your friends. It really goes a long way to help us get out there. So thanks, everyone. It's good to talk to you again, and I will talk to you soon.